What if MH370's captain, Zaharie Ahmad Shah, stole the plane and took it into the southern Indian Ocean on a mass murder-suicide mission? If that happened, then we know from Inmarsat data that the plane flew south for 6 hours and then sent a final burst of signals which were recorded and indicated a steep dive into the southern Indian Ocean. It's one thing to know that the plane went into a dive, but to understand just what the consequences of that dive were requires trying to recreate that dive in a simulator to see what the plane is doing, what kind of attitude it has entered, how fast it's going, in order to really understand what might have happened next. At the moment that the final transmission was sent to the Inmarsat satellite, the plane had already run out of fuel, was already on a one-way ticket into the ocean. How long that flight took, how far it went in the course of that trip, is what we have to determine if we're going to try to find the plane on the seabed. An effort that has so far been unsuccessful, even though an area the size of Great Britain has been searched. What are the remaining possibilities? To try to get at that, we're going to go inside a flight simulator where the pilots are trying to exactly recreate the data as it was received by Inmarsat. The goal of today's episode is to try to figure out exactly what MH370 was doing at the moment it impacted the ocean. Hi, this is Jeff Wise, and welcome to episode 4 of Finding MH370, the second season of the Deep Dive MH370 podcast. I'm a science journalist specializing in aviation. I wrote the book, The Taking of MH370. You might know me from the Netflix documentary series MH370, The Plane That Disappeared. Thanks for joining me. As I'll say, as I always do, that if you enjoy what this podcast is about, please hit like or subscribe. You'll notice that things are a little different this episode. We've decided to, since we're taking the podcast in a different direction, focusing, it's more of a solo act on my part. We're doing more expert interviews. I decided to call this something different. It is a continuation of the Deep Dive MH370 podcast, but we're calling it Finding MH370. Hopefully that will make everything a little clearer in viewers' and listeners' minds. I'm excited for my interview today with Erin Murphy, who's going to shed some light into what happened to the plane if it did go into the Southern Ocean. And if you stick around after that interview, we're going to have a special community radar with Emily Morgul, the social media director. She's going to have some really cool information that a reader sent in about possible landing spots in Kazakhstan. So let's get right to it. Erin, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I've been wanting to have you on for a long time. I want you to start by telling us where you made this video of the final minutes of MH370's flight, if it did go into the Southern Ocean. You made this at a flight simulator facility that you work at near Toronto, Canada. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. It's great to see you again. Thanks for having me on the podcast. The video footage we're going to look at is from the UFly simulator 777-200 sim that we have there. It's an exact replica, exact scale, and the accuracy of that flight deck, I would say, approaches 95% when you're just looking at the physical flight simulator itself. And we're located just near the Pearson Airport at Myerside and Dixie Road.
Okay. And so this is a facility that people can come and use for entertainment. It's not really used for training pilots, but it is a pretty good demonstration. I think that most likely the electronics, the avionics aren't maybe 100% faithful to what a 777 actually is like, but in terms of aerodynamics, how changes in engine power would affect flight, attitude, and so forth, I think it's quite a good simulator for this purpose, which is to try to find out what would have happened to MH370 in its final minutes based on the Inmarsat data that was retrieved. If the plane did go into Southern Indian Ocean, this is what would have happened based on what we know.
That's correct. The Southern Indian Ocean scenario, which you've explained fully in the in season 1, absolutely, that was a fantastic job explaining that possibility. Okay.
So, but in terms of the accuracy, in terms of how this plane is going to fly, what kind of speeds, what kind of attitudes it's going to result in when you do things like let the fuel go to exhaustion and has no more engine power. In that regard, I think what you're going to get out of it is a pretty reasonable simulation.
Oh, absolutely. The flight dynamics, I think, are the easiest things to model with the mathematic computation power of modern day computers. You can model that the physics of flight quite easily. The computers know the weight of the aircraft, they know how fast it's flying, and it's really not that complicated to calculate the math to create the glide path, the glide distance, the effects of turbulence in the atmosphere, which is kind of random really most of the time anyway. But yeah, it's a very accurate model of what could have happened.
Okay, so to set the stage, the scenario is that Captain Zahari has hijacked this plane. He's turned it towards the Southern Ocean. The plane has been flying for about 6 hours. It's gone more or less in a straight line towards the 7th arc. And as it's flying along, the fuel is getting lower and lower and lower. And then somewhere around 2 minutes and 30 seconds after midnight Universal Time, the plane, the right engine ran out of fuel. This is what Boeing and the experts at the ATSB presumed based on known engine performance by knowing how much fuel was on board and so forth. So the idea is that the plane is flying along, one of the engines runs out of fuel, the other engine keeps running, and then a few minutes later, let me say this, at 11 minutes past midnight, the satellite data unit transmits a regularly scheduled hourly ping. That is received by Inmarsat, it's recorded, it's just a normal ping like all the others. Then, 6.5 minutes later, the left engine runs out of fuel. And what happens next is essentially a big part of trying to solve the mystery of MH370. What did the plane do in those moments after it ran out of fuel? And this is where you started your simulation. You basically, as we're starting to watch this video, you're flying along at 40,000 feet. We're going to see you and your co-pilot are going to show us the flight deck. Could you tell us a little bit who your co-pilot is? Is your colleague?
Yes, the co-pilot that day was the owner of UFly Simulator. That's Claudio Texera. Claudio, who is in the right seat for this particular video footage. Yes.
Okay, great. So we're going to hear your voice to start, and then also you're going to hear Claudio's voice. Let's go ahead and roll the tape.
Okay.
All right, we're over the Indian Ocean now, and we are recreating the flight path of MH370 to the best of our abilities. And I'm just going to bring you inside the cockpit now, and let's take a look at our current situation on the primary flight display. We're cruising at about Mach 0.821 at exactly 40,000 feet, and we have the autopilot on. Now, the aircraft is in speed, heading select, and altitude mode. Typically on a trip, it would be in a different mode. It would not be in a manual type mode. It would be in a mode that is controlled by the flight management computer in the control display units, so the small computers that sit beside the pilots. And I'm just going to pan across now. There's our navigation display, and we would see waypoints of various locations on our trip, depending on the scale, what size scale we have on that display. And coming across the ICAS, I'm going to zoom in right here, and we're going to take a good look at the fuel. So assuming the aircraft has been flying for several hours, as MH370 was, we are now getting into a low fuel situation, and the fuel quantity is now dipped down to 0.9 tons in the center tank, 1.1 and 1.1, and soon there will be the engines will flame out. We're going to burn through the rest of this fuel, and the engines are going to flame out, and that's when some interesting things start to happen with the 777.
So Aaron, in the clip we just saw, you've set the fuel to quite low, and you're going to let it burn down to 0. one of the engines ran out of fuel at 2:30, 2 minutes 30 seconds after midnight. The other one ran for another 15 minutes, which sounds like a lot. It doesn't matter that one ran out first because the rudder, there's an automatic mechanism that moves the rudder to compensate for the asymmetry of thrust. So the plane was going to still be flying straight. However, one engine generates less thrust than two. So in real life, there would have been maybe a bit of a drift down. It probably would have lost a little bit of altitude to compensate for the loss of thrust. Also, what we're going to see here is that in your simulator, both engines were running at like 80% power. I think in real life, when you lose one engine, the other engine probably powers up. It goes to probably full power to compensate for the lack of thrust. But what I wanted to do, Aaron, is go ahead and watch what happens when the fuel runs out. Here we go.
All right, we have had the left engine flame out now. It's official. The beginning of the engines flaming out has now started. We'll continue to watch the engines, and there, the second engine just flamed out. We are officially out of fuel. Looking on the right side, the captain's instrumentation has now got dark because the aircraft is on battery. I'm going to come around to the front here, and I'm going to start the stopwatch now. We need about 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Let's see how the performance is on the way down here.
And Aaron, just to let you know that the warning that we're getting is, number one, the autopilot is disconnected. So the plane is starting to descend at a rate already at 3,200 feet per minute. We're still keeping the speed though, and the plane is still descending pretty straight. It's not turning any way at all.
Okay, so what you're talking about is all these alarms are going off, and because the autopilot has disengaged, because there's been a temporary power interruption, because the engines are running the generators are providing the power. You lose the engines, you lose the power. It takes time for the APU and the tail. We've talked about this in other episodes. The last fuel in the fuel line is going to allow the auxiliary power unit and the tail to start up. That's going to return electrical power. In the meantime, the rat is going to deploy, and we can talk a little bit about that. But what's really interesting is this plane now has no engine thrust. And people tend to think, oh, the plane without engine power is going to just fall out of the sky. That's not what happens.
Not at all. A dual engine flameout is extremely rare, but I always direct people to the most famous case of a dual engine flameout would be Sully's flight into the Hudson that day. That was a fully controlled descent, and the landing was perfect.
Well, so one thing we don't know is what, if the plane did go to the south, what Zahari was doing. Was he trying to do a miracle on the Hudson? I mean, obviously he's flown all this way, presumably to commit murder-suicide. There is no real good outcome here, but he might try to glide it and have a slow, lingering death, or he might try to plunge it straight in. But what happens at this stage is that the plane, sort of left to its own, is going to enter into the nose is basically going to fall. It no longer has thrust. The plane basically wants to fly at the same speed without engine thrust. The way it does that is by converting some of that altitude into energy. It's going to basically turn into a glider, as you said. But it's not going to plunge. It's not going to plummet. It's going to be a pretty moderate rate of descent. We're going to watch what happens as this evolves. What you guys did here was not have your hands on the controls. Just let the plane do whatever it wanted to do. So let's go back to the tape and see what happens. The plane currently, by the way, is at 20, as I'm pausing this, it's at 24,000 feet. I'm sorry, it's at 38,000 feet, so it's lost about 2,000 feet, and it's flying a little bit slower than before, but it's very similar to where it was when it ran out of fuel. So let's see what happens next.
Correct?
All right, so I'm just fixating here on the instrumentation, and so checking the time again here. We got 49 seconds, tons of time, and you can see the descent rate is not that extreme. It is sort of stabilized, and the airspeed is actually stabilized less than cruise. And just for the sake of, not driving everybody crazy, I'm going to get rid of the autopilot disconnect warning there. I know that wouldn't have happened in real life, but the autopilot disconnect triggers that warning, and then the pilots must stop the warning, and that's what I just did, just so it doesn't drive us all mad.
Okay, so you guys have turned off the alarm just because it's annoying, and the plane is now starting to enter a bank to the right. And again, this is something that you would see in real life where there's just little bobbles and stuff. I think you actually talk about this on the tape, but the plane is now going to be entering in. If you take a plane up, and I've tried this in a Cessna, and you just let your hands off the controls, it sort of falls into a gradual spiral, and you'll get what's called a spiral dive. That's a very common end state for planes that are out of control, pilots confused or incapacitated. But you're not doing anything at this point.
No, we took our hands off the control. We were on the autopilot, so your hands are not on the controls at that point anyway. You're steering the aircraft with the mode control panel, which is up at the glare shield. Altitude, heading, and airspeed is located on the MCP. So we let it go. We let it flame out, and I knew it would be a very gentle change in the dynamics of the flight just because of experience with flying. And as you mentioned earlier there, the speed of the aircraft will maintain pretty much where you were. The nose will dip down a little bit to maintain the airspeed because the elevator is trimmed to maintain that speed. The aircraft is in trim for that airspeed.
The scene that we're at right now, the stage we're at right now, is that the plane has run out of fuel. The RAT has deployed this little windmill that is generating electricity, enough electricity and hydraulic power that you've got this primary flight display, you've got your flight controls, and you have enough hydraulic power to move the flight surfaces. What happens next is that the generator in the tail, the auxiliary power unit, or APU, has restarted, or it's in the process of restarting. That is then going to supply electricity to the satellite data unit, which had powered down due to the engine flame out. Now that's getting restarted, and then what that's going to do is that at 19 minutes past the hour, it's going to send new signals, and those signals are going to include metadata that will allow scientists to determine the rate of descent of the airplane. But that only happens at 19 minutes past the hour. So you guys were careful to wait for that amount of time to try to match the rate of descent that was determined by the BFO data. The APU the APU had turned on. It provided power to the SDU, the satellite data unit, part of the SATCOM. The SATCOM comes back to life and sends a signal to the Inmarsat satellite, which gets recorded and which includes this rate of descent information. You're now going to simulate how the plane was descending when that signal was received. And I want to just point out that a well-known independent group member, Mike Exner, who's very knowledgeable about this kind of stuff, said that in a comment to a blog post or something, he said that that the independent group and the ATSB estimates that at the time that signal, the first signal of the seventh arc, was sent, the plane was at 20,000 feet. And that is actually a lot lower than you are in the simulator right now. I think that we were trying to operate on sort of the outer bounds of how the higher the plane is, the further it can go. And the further it can go, the bigger the search area is. So we're trying to err on the side of maximum uncertainty. What we're about to see is you and your co-pilot attempting to recreate the conditions of descent that were observed in this Inmarsat data at the time of the seventh ping. And basically, in a nutshell, what this was, it was 19 minutes and 29 seconds past midnight Universal Time. the first signal is sent. And this indicates a rate of descent of 5,000 feet per minute. That is pretty brisk, but it's within the normal operation. Like if you were coming into San Francisco and the controller wanted you to get down, that's not an unreasonable rate of descent, yeah?
Yeah, if you would have, you'd be in flight idle, you have possibly spoilers all the way out, landing gear down. If you're slow enough, yeah, that would be a number. You wouldn't want to do that on a regular basis, but it's all about the speed of the aircraft. If you're not overspeeding the aircraft according to flap setting and your speed indications, it's totally doable. It's not a problem.
Okay. So 5,000 is within the normal realm.
It's the high end. It's the high end for sure.
High end, but normal. And then that's at 29 seconds past 19 minutes. But then 8 seconds later, it's 1937, the rate of descent is something on the order. It depends on variables. It could be a little bit more, it could be less, but it's somewhere in the order of 15,000 feet per minute. How would you characterize that?
That is extremely fast. Yeah, I don't know what speed would be associated at that point because I don't know the configuration of the aircraft, but if it's clean at 15,000 feet per minute, that's probably going to be overspeeding. So you're going beyond the structural limitations of the aircraft at that point.
Right. And I would point out that these are two moments almost randomly chosen in time. They show a plane that is going pretty steeply down and then really steeply down. So we're seeing a change. We're seeing an acceleration downwards. And I think it's safe to assume that depending on how this dive evolved, we can assume that the plane would have descended even faster after that. What we're witnessing is a plane that is going from a slightly nose-down configuration to an almost vertically nose-down configuration. And so we're going to watch how this happens, what this looks like from the cockpit of a plane that is entering this kind of a steep dive. Here we go.
All right, so now for part two of our scenario, Claudio's now going to control the aircraft, rolling the wings level, and pitching the nose down to get us 5,000 feet per minute rate of descent. So I'll keep the camera right on that. And you can see it's going to very quickly blow through 5. So there, it doesn't take much at all to get the airplane down to 5,000 feet per minute. He's pretty close, a little high, but that's all right. And now let's just see what it takes to get it to 16,000 feet per minute. Very, very gradually, try to space it out down to 16,000 feet per minute.
16,000?
With just not immediately, but over about 10 seconds if you can do it. And I think it's going to stop at 9,000. And look at that. There's the maximum indication on the vertical speed. It's 9,998 feet per minute.
Now look at the speed going crazy.
Right, and now we have an overspeed warning happening. So that one, yeah, that's a tough one to get a specific. The radar data is needed to know what these high rates of descent are in the cases of airplanes that crash at very high rates of speed. All right, and now, Claudio, if you want to go completely nose down, let's slam it down. We'll see how long it takes to hit starting now. And I'm going to reset the clock on that. And we're just going to do a dive now to the ocean. And we're there. So I'm going to add about 5 seconds to that. And you can see clearly out the window, there's nothing but water beneath us now. Back inside. And that rate of descent, we have no clue what our rate of descent is. Let's see if the ground proximity warning system, the radar altimeter, kicks in here near the end of our voyage, which should be near zero or sea level. And there's the radar altimeter kicking in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. It's over, and that's it. And our simulator is set up to just bounce when it hits something on the flying.
Okay, so the final speed recorded was 660 knots, which might be over Mach 1, I don't know. I mean, you're basically, I think if this plane went nose down in a clean configuration, you're going to have pieces ripping off it.
That's the whole point of having the maximum speed limit of the aircraft. I mean, the 777-200 has 330 knots as its maximum speed. I think it's a 0.86 Mach. Down at sea level, I think the speed of sound is approximately, 750 knots or something like that. I would expect, from what you've described, what the data describes, is that this aircraft may have actually gone supersonic before it entered the water, which it's possible if it was in clean configuration, yeah.
So this is why the ATSB was pretty confident that they were going to find MH370 really close to the 7th arc, because that final plunge after that final indication of, I had said 15,000 feet to you. I guess it was 16,000 was what you're aiming for. It's within the margin of error. It only takes a minute for the plane to hit the surface from 30,000 feet when you're looking at that kind of accelerating dive. And you're not going to get very far away from the point where you transmitted that signal in a minute when you're mostly going down. And so if what happened in that plane is what you just simulated in the simulator today, the plane almost certainly would have been found. When planes hit the water really, really hard, or the land, even if you're talking about a supersonic impact or near supersonic impact, you tend to have things like landing gear more or less intact, and the tail, because the tail is the last thing that hits.
Yeah.
So you would have recognizable pieces of debris on the seabed. So what this tells us is that since the plane wasn't found really close to the 7th arc, the implication is that either it was much further to the north or south, or that, which seems really unlikely since they searched such a long area, such a long section of that 7th arc, or Zahari had a change of heart, that after putting it into a very steep, almost vertical dive, he decided that he did not want to end it like that right then, and either put it into a glide and try to extend how far the plane went. I mean, you suggested that maybe there was a struggle in the cockpit or something.
It can point to a number of different things, and just the fact that everyone is human, and no matter how psychologically challenged you may be, you have self-preservation in the amygdala, in the very core of your brain, that will try to prevent you from your own demise. And anyone in that situation who is attempting to commit suicide, let's say that's what it was, that triggers sometimes it triggers soon enough that, a person on a bridge will step back and go, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Even though they're in a haze of drugs or alcohol, they will still step back because their self-preservation mode has triggered. And maybe this is what's happened in this case. There's, like, as you've exposed in, all of your work on this subject, there are so many twists and turns and unknowns and pathways you can go down with this story with different outcomes. But, your point about following the evidence, following the facts that we know, which I sure wish there was more to go on, it would certainly help a lot. But yeah, there's a lot of possibilities when you really start looking at the information very closely, as you've done over the last 10 years of your life, right?
Yeah. It's been a while. But Aaron, I think that there are a lot of possibilities, but there's also those possibilities are limited. And in this case, the more that the authorities searched the seabed, the fewer and fewer possibilities remained. And what we're left with now is, frankly, a very short menu of very strange possibilities. And I think the take-home lesson from today is that, yes, it's possible for the pilot to have changed his mind and tried to get it into a glide. But if he did that, he then probably changed his mind again and then put it into a steep dive, because the plane did not. We know that the plane did not come down in a gentle Sullenberger way, because there was pieces of the interior that were fragmented. So the plane did rupture. If it crashed into the ocean, it ruptured open, and small pieces of the interior were ripped apart. So it does imply a violent impact. However, the point I want to make is that there's only a minute between the last Inmarsat ping and an impact with the ocean if you do continue that dive. Doesn't give you a lot of time to change your mind. And the longer you wait, the further you can't go.
you get to a point where should you initiate a recovery, and if you initiate that recovery too aggressively, you'll break the airplane because of the extreme G loads you're going to impose on the airframe immediately when you start pulling back on the yoke. And of course, as you watch the ocean coming closer and closer at high rate of speed and high rate of descent, your self-preservation is probably going to kick in, and you're going to just crank on those controls. You're going to pull back on the yoke, and you're going to break something, and then the airplane's just going to literally just keep falling into the ocean because something's seriously gone wrong with the airframe. So,
that's a really good point.
Right?
That's a really good point.
Hard to make
narrows
that
the
recovery.
window of action. In fact, in Air France 447, we know from the cockpit voice recorder that something like that happened, that they finally realized why they were descending, but it was too late. They didn't have enough time to do the thing that would save them.
Yeah, they're heading down. They're in a full stall, and this is the Air France. They're in that full stall condition. They're pancaking basically into the ocean. You have to push the nose down to break the stall. They probably had the thrust at maximum thrust already, and it just wasn't enough because they were in such a weird stalled condition. You have to push the nose down to break the stall, because the stall is about angle of attack. It's not about airspeed whatsoever. It's about breaking through a critical angle of attack. So
that's a good point.
You need space to recover. Yes.
It takes time.
Yeah.
It takes vertical space to recover.
Yeah.
And so if you're near supersonic, have a change of heart, you can't pull back fully on the controls. There's a speed, maximum maneuvering speed, or maneuvering velocity, where you have to be careful not to go too fast if you're in turbulence, for instance, because, the plane can break. It can't take unlimited G-forces, so...
Exactly.
This is all real interesting food for thought, and I think, Aaron, this demonstrates my philosophy, which is we can understand the mystery better by looking more closely at it. We knew that the plane had sent signals at the 7th arc. We knew that it implied certain rates of descent, but it's not until you took this data and tried to recreate it in the simulator that we really understood what that meant in terms of how the final moments of this plane would have played out. And it really demonstrates how narrow that window of recovery would be for the plane to have gone into a glide and wound up beyond the search area, which was, I think, about 40 or 50 nautical miles beyond the 7th arc.
Yeah, for sure. And it's hard to know what more to add to, this part of the story, because we have limited information, limited data. You can play out a lot of different scenarios in your mind. And I think that's what a lot of people get caught in. As you've mentioned, people get onto something where they're thinking, aha, this is exactly what it is. And as soon as you get that bias going, everything you see adds to that. And you've called that something in one of the episodes in season 1. I can't remember what it was called.
Confirmation bias.
Oh, absolutely. And don't we all suffer from that at times? As soon as you get onto that track, a little bit of that good old human obsession gets going, and suddenly you think you're right, and nothing can change your mind. And that's the most dangerous point you can be in with anything, because then now your mind is closed to any new information, right?
That's such a core idea.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the real core ideas of this podcast is that the authorities were very confident that they knew where they would find the plane. They ultimately realized that one of their assumptions must have been wrong because the plane wasn't there. So the question became, well, which of our assumptions was wrong?
Right.
And if you're too wedded to your ideas and you're like, no, all of my assumptions must have been right, they're all good assumptions. So it isn't like, so at this point, the question isn't like, what theory do we find most appealing? It's like, what are all the assumptions and how could they have gone wrong? We need to try to keep in mind a lot of different possibilities.
Right.
Not have a beauty pageant and try to choose the one that's most appealing.
Exactly. And, you take the word assume, as most of us have heard this before, you make an ass of you and me. And it's so fitting to this situation, because people are so willing to just get caught into that mindset of, aha, like I said, that's exactly what's happened here. It must be. What else could it possibly be? But as you're pointing out time after time, whenever you're going into a particular scenario that maybe someone has asked you to do on the podcast, or something you're coming along with in your information, you are constantly stopping yourself because you're seeing the flaws in the data or in the information. And this is like watching a fantastic series on TV, like a Sherlock Holmes or something, where Sherlock is trying to solve the mystery. And, he steers us through all these different ideas and all the evidence that comes up, but he points out how it doesn't quite make sense. And that's what you're really doing with this is, well, what is the answer? Will we ever be able to figure this out? I'm not so sure anymore because it's so convoluted.
Well, I think that we can. I am assuming that we can because I want to do everything that we can. And it really is a collective effort. And Aaron, you've been so helpful and so supportive and so willing to, and you're so game to try out things like this simulation we just went through. So I really appreciate that. I want to thank you for taking the time again. Let's have one more shout out for the UFly Sim. It's available for, tell them about the website. What's the URL that they can go to find it?
Just search UFly Simulator. It's going to take you straight to the web page. It'll take you to, if you just Google that or search that, you're going to see the UFly Simulator website. Click on the link, away you go. You're going to see my smiling face somewhere in the pictures on the front page. And Jeff, as I always say to you, we have this fantastic simulator at our disposal. I just ask you to use it as much as you need to for this podcast. The MH370 story to me, as I've said before, is extremely important as well. CNN and Martin Savage came into UFly Simulator 10 years ago when that aircraft went missing. They spent 1 month there trying to figure out and hoping the aircraft would be located and they could report on it and all the information would come out. They gave up after 30 days because the story went cold. It's like, wow, this is just incredible. So my link to the story is almost as strong as yours. You've obviously done more work. You've done more research. You've made it a core point of your life. But I feel like I'm an important part of the story because I have access to that simulator. We can bring people into that simulator either in the podcast or, they can come and visit themselves and fly that thing, and it's a lot of fun and it's extremely educational. It's a very good simulator for learning all about flight and the 777 in particular.
Fantastic. Well, we'll leave it at that. Again, Aaron, thank you again so much, and let's keep working on this together.
I'll see you on the next one, Jeff. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. I want to thank Aaron Murphy so much for bringing us into his flight simulator and sharing those results with us. It's quite illuminating. Let's move on now to my favorite segment of this show, Community Radar, where we check in with what people, listeners, readers, just people out there in the world are thinking about MH370. And to guide us through it, we have, as usual, our social media director, Emily Morgul. Emily, how are you?
I'm great. How are you, Jeff?
I'm doing great. What's the buzz? What are people talking about?
So actually, we had a longtime fan of the podcast. Her name is Keely, and she went down a rabbit hole of research, which we love here, right?
Yes.
And she did extensive research on all of the possible airstrips along the 7th arc. And one specifically was the Kambala airfield, which has the advantage of having a runway, a large hangar, and a rail infrastructure. So
yeah,
I'm
lots
sure
of infrastructure.
Yeah.
She uncovered. She was very exhaustive. Actually, she's an amazing researcher based out of the UK. She's kind of private, so I don't want to talk too much about her details. I don't even know too much of the details, but she is indefatigable. There, I risked saying that word. She's tireless in her pursuit of clues and stuff. She's actually worked on a bunch of stuff, and she's always sending me information and stuff she's found. But this was a really interesting one because as I've talked about, I got really obsessed with this Russian territory on Kazakh soil where they launch all these rockets from. I didn't know until Keely started doing all of this research that there's other places in Kazakhstan, also not too far from the 7th arc, actually more reachable given what we know about the fuel load that MH370 had. And this one, I think, of all the ones that she found, some of them had different kinds of drawbacks. Like some of them were just really stretches of road more than proper runways. There was some really interesting ones, but they would have required the plane to kind of turn back and go back the way it came, which seemed kind of implausible to me. She likes this one. I like this one. It's really cool. And I want to thank her for making a video about it. And she taught herself Google Earth Studio, which lets you make animations from Google Earth. So let's talk about some of the interesting things, why this is such an interesting airstrip.
So for me specifically, when you take a plane, right, a 747, that's a huge piece of equipment.
777.
Yeah, sorry, 777. It's a huge piece of equipment, and it's going to need a huge amount of space to be able to dismantle it properly. And you need some place that's deserted enough so that nobody...
Need some privacy.
Or if some people come across it, like by accident, they're taught not to ask questions.
Yeah, you don't want that. So this place is called Kambala. And it has a really interesting history.
Yeah. So actually in my notes it said that Russia has been long been suspected of using this as a missile test base.
You know, I'm old enough to remember in the 80s when Ronald Reagan wanted to create this sort of anti-ballistic missile shield called Star Wars, and he was going to spend all this money. And then, of course, we basically won the Cold War. A lot of people credit Reagan for that. And some people say that his decision to spend billions and billions of dollars on Star Wars helped bankrupt the Soviet Union because they just couldn't keep up with the spending required. This place, Kambala, is actually an anti-ballistic missile test range. Interesting. So it is potentially interesting, just as there were all these kind of curious resonances with the launch facility that I was so interested in at Baikonur, that had these historical resonances with the space shuttle, where they were trying to keep up with our space program. Here again, we have what looks like a facility that has historical resonances and shows how the Soviet Union was trying to keep up with us and kind of bankrupted themselves in the process. It's still a Russian base. It's like Baikonur. It's leased by Russia from Kazakhstan. But you're right. This would be a perfect place to A, land it, B, maybe hide it. I hadn't really looked at it. There's hangars. I mean, maybe I should take a look at this. It would be really interesting if they built a hangar like a month before the plane disappeared. You know, my famous obsession with the dirt pile in Baikonur. But I don't know. What do you think?
So as I'm sitting here thinking about it, I'm thinking about the corpses that would have been aboard the plane.
Right.
What was it, 239?
239 minus whoever was the perpetrators, I guess you'd say.
Yeah. So 200 and we'll say 38 people.
Right.
That's a lot of people. That's a lot of corpses to have to move.
Right.
So, and that's going to take a significant amount of time. That in itself is going to take a significant amount of time, plus the dismantling of the plane. So I think that if they had the resources there from either beforehand or they figured out how to put those resources there to make their job easier, I don't see why it couldn't be a possibility. Because we've already established that Russia does some James Bond-like trickery. So when you think about it realistically, how difficult would it be for somebody to land a plane in the middle of nowhere?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what this shows, like, it's frankly, it's pure speculation to try to say, well, it was this, to say it was this runway, but it does improve on, it does sort of, I would say, eliminate some of the problems that Baikonur had, namely that it was hard to imagine how it would get all the way to Baikonur on the fuel load that it has. As I say, I think this one would be easier to get to, although I haven't done the fuel calculations. But there's options. I mean, I think that the real take-home from this kind of research is that there are multiple options. You can't say, well, they couldn't have taken to Kazakhstan because there's no place to land. Well, no, we know because of this research that there's places to land. So I think we should leave it at that. Thank you, Emily. It's always great. I love kind of opening this up, and you're such a great resource to keeping your ear to the ground. And helping us figure out TikTok. One of the things I mentioned really early in the podcast is that we're sort of rebranding it. It was a little confusing that this is now kind of a solo show with guests and helpers coming in. It's not this kind of two-handed version that it was before. So I'm calling this the second season of Deep Dive MH370, but the podcast itself is called Finding MH370. We have the findingmh370.com URL, which we're going to be sort of focusing on. And Emily, you've been very forcefully in charge of the TikTok and the Instagram, and that we're going to rebrand those as well. So hopefully going forward, we'll have a nice, clean rebrand, and it'll be clear in everyone's mind what exactly is going on. But I did want to sort of explain that a little bit.
And I'd really like to thank Keely for her tireless efforts for sending that information our way, because it's just another piece of the puzzle that kind of fits together.
Science is a collaborative effort. I think finding MH370 is going to require a collaborative effort. I would never have been able to put together the pieces that I have been able to put together without the contributions of a ton of other people and lots of experts who are willing to lend their expertise, and just normal people. I'm a normal person. I'm not a scientist. I'm just a person who cares enough to look into it. So thank you, Keely. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the people who have been supporting us. We have like a whole bunch of new subscribers on Substack and some new paid subscribers. Deeply grateful to everyone who shows their support in that way. It's much, much, much appreciated. If all you want to do is hit like or subscribe on YouTube, please do. We really appreciate that. And, if you have questions or comments or suggestions or tips or anything, shoot it right our way, because we really appreciate it.
And don't forget to tell your friends, your family, your dog, your cousin, everybody. Everybody needs to know about Finding MH370. Okay?
That's a great point. Thank you, Emily. Thank you to everybody. This has been episode 4 of Finding MH370. Until next week, don't stop looking and don't stop asking hard questions. See you next time.